I thought I knew what family loyalty meant until I discovered my husband's brother had been secretly recording my most intimate moments for over 3 years. Reggie Sinclair had always been the responsible older brother, the successful tech entrepreneur who mentored my husband Kirk through college and helped us buy our first home. But when I found the hidden server room behind our basement wall, I realized the man who'd been our closest family friend had been living a twisted double life. What I discovered in those encrypted files would not only shatter my marriage to Kirk, but expose a network of surveillance that reached into dozens of homes across our quiet suburb of Millbrook, ultimately forcing our entire community to confront the monster who'd been watching us all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in our peaceful Millbrook neighborhood. October rain drummed against the windows of our colonial-style home on Maple Street as I prepared breakfast for Kirk before his marketing consulting meetings downtown. We'd lived in this house for 4 years now, ever since Reggie helped us with the down payment when Kirk's startup consulting firm was still struggling to find its footing. Reggie Sinclair was everything you'd want in a brother-in-law. At 38, he was 6 years older than Kirk, and had always taken his role as the protective big brother seriously. When their parents died in a car accident 10 years ago, Reggie had stepped up to help Kirk finish college, co-signing loans and providing emotional support through the grief. He'd built his own cybersecurity company, Sinclair Digital Solutions, from the ground up, and now employed over 50 people in downtown Portland. Saint Reggie, I used to joke with Kirk, though always affectionately. Reggie never missed a birthday, always remembered our anniversary, and showed up to every family barbecue with thoughtful gifts and stories from his latest business travels. He was the kind of man who fixed your computer problems without being asked, who recommended the perfect contractor when we needed roof repairs, who somehow always knew exactly what we needed before we did. When we'd house hunted 4 years ago, it was Reggie who'd found this particular property. Perfect starter home for a young couple, he'd said, walking through the empty rooms with an architect's eye for detail. Great bones, excellent security potential, and the basement has room for expansion. He'd even recommended the home inspector and helped negotiate the price down by $20,000. Kirk trusted his brother implicitly, and honestly, so did I. Reggie had never been anything but respectful, supportive, and genuinely caring toward our relationship. He'd been the best man at our wedding, giving a speech that had everyone in tears about how Kirk had found his perfect match in me. He dated occasionally but never seriously, always claiming he was too focused on building his business to settle down. Besides, he'd often joke at family dinners, "Someone has to make sure you two don't burn the house down while figuring out married life." That Tuesday morning, Kirk was rushing around the kitchen, grabbing his travel mug and kissing me goodbye before heading to a client presentation in Seattle. He'd be gone for 3 days, working on a major rebranding project for a tech startup that could really boost his consulting firm's profile. "Reggie's coming by later to check the new security system installation," Kirk called from the hallway. "He wants to make sure everything's properly configured before I get back." I nodded, not thinking much of it. Reggie had upgraded our home security system twice since we'd moved in, always insisting on the latest technology to keep us safe. "Crime rates are rising in suburban areas," he'd explained each time. "Better to be over-prepared than sorry." The first upgrade had come after a supposed break-in 2 streets over. The second followed reports of package thieves in the neighborhood. After Kirk left, I settled into my usual Tuesday routine. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, primarily creating marketing materials for small businesses around Portland. It was fulfilling work that allowed me to be creative while maintaining the flexibility Kirk and I needed, as we planned to start a family. Around 10 a.m., I was deep into designing a logo for a local bakery when I heard footsteps on the front porch. Through the window, I saw Reggie's familiar silver BMW in our driveway. He had a key to our house, something Kirk had insisted on after Reggie had helped us through a plumbing emergency last winter when we were both out of town. "Claudia? It's just me," Reggie called as he entered through the front door. "Hope you don't mind me letting myself in. Didn't want to interrupt your workflow." I smiled, saving my design file and walking to the entryway where Reggie was already removing his jacket. He looked every bit the successful businessman in his tailored navy suit and expensive leather shoes, but his expression seemed different today. More intense, more focused. "How's the new security system working out?" he asked, though his eyes weren't quite meeting mine the way they usually did. Great, I think, though honestly, I barely notice it's there unless the alarm chirps when I come home. That's exactly how good security should be, Reggie replied, pulling what looked like a tablet from his briefcase, invisible until you need it. Mind if I run some diagnostics? Just want to make sure all the sensors are properly calibrated. Of course, do whatever you need to do. For the next hour, I worked in my home office while Reggie moved through the house, checking various components of the security system. I could hear him in the basement, the master bedroom, even the guest bathroom. Occasionally he'd call out technical terms I didn't understand, explaining that he was testing wireless signals and camera angles. It wasn't until I went to the kitchen for more coffee that I noticed something odd. Reggie was crouched beside our refrigerator, using some kind of small tool to adjust something near the baseboard. When he heard my footsteps, he straightened quickly, almost defensively. Just recalibrating the motion sensor range, he explained, but something in his tone felt off, making sure it's not too sensitive to normal household movement. I didn't realize we had a motion sensor in the kitchen, I said, trying to sound casual while a strange unease began settling in my stomach. Reggie's smile seemed forced, part of the new upgrade, more comprehensive coverage for better security. He packed his tools back into his briefcase with unusual haste. All set now, everything should be running perfectly. After he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been different about his visit. Maybe it was the way he'd avoided eye contact, or how quickly he'd finished and departed without his usual chat about work and family. Reggie typically stayed for coffee and conversation whenever he stopped by, asking about my design projects and sharing stories from his latest business developments. That afternoon, as I tried to focus on client work, my mind kept drifting back to that moment by the refrigerator. What kind of motion sensor needed to be installed so low to the ground, and why hadn't I noticed it during any of his previous visits? The question gnawed at me through the rest of the day, creating a persistent itch of curiosity that I couldn't quite scratch. By evening, I found myself walking through the house with new eyes, looking for signs of the security equipment Reggie had mentioned. But everything appeared normal, just our familiar furniture, family photos, and the life Kirk and I had built together in our safe, secure home. If only I had known then that safety was just an illusion, and the person I trusted most to protect it had been the one destroying it all along. The rest of that week passed in what I now realize was blissful ignorance. Kirk returned from Seattle on Friday with exciting news about landing the tech startup contract, and we celebrated with dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant downtown. Reggie joined us as he often did for our Friday night celebrations, regaling us with stories from his latest cybersecurity conference and asking detailed questions about Kirk's new project. "You two are really building something special," Reggie said as we shared tiramisu, his eyes warm with what seemed like genuine pride. "Dad would have been so proud to see how far you've both come." It was moments like these that reminded me why I'd grown to love Reggie like the brother I'd never had. My own family lived across the country in North Carolina, and holidays were often just the three of us, Kirk, Reggie, and me, creating our own traditions in our cozy Millbrook home. The following Monday morning brought our usual routine. Kirk headed to his office downtown while I settled into my home workspace with a fresh cup of coffee and my latest project, designing a website header for a local veterinary clinic. The house felt peaceful and secure, just as it always had. The new security system hummed quietly in the background, occasional soft beeps confirming that all sensors were functioning normally. Around 10:30, my phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Elizabeth Hawthorne. We'd been college roommates at Portland State and had stayed close even after she'd moved to the suburban community of Westbridge, about 20 minutes away. "Coffee date this afternoon. Need to escape the chaos of unpacking," her message read. Elizabeth and her husband Angus had just moved into a new house, and she'd been complaining for weeks about the stress of organizing their belongings while juggling her job as a pediatric nurse. "Absolutely. My place at 2, I replied, grateful for the excuse to take a break from work. Elizabeth arrived that afternoon with dark circles under her eyes and her usually perfect blonde hair pulled into a messy ponytail. "I'm losing my mind," she announced, collapsing onto our living room couch. "Angus is working 12-hour shifts at the hospital, and I'm surrounded by boxes that seem to multiply when I'm not looking." I made her chamomile tea and listened as she vented about contractors, utility companies, and the general nightmare of establishing a new household. As we talked, I found myself studying our own living space with fresh appreciation. Everything was exactly where it should be, organized and comfortable after 4 years of gradual improvement. You and Kirk are so lucky, Elizabeth said, noticing my gaze. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You've had time to really make this place your own, and having Reggie's help with all the technical stuff must be amazing. Angus can barely program the coffee maker, let alone install security systems. Reggie has been incredible, I agreed. Sometimes I think Kirk and I would still be living in that tiny apartment if his brother hadn't helped us figure out homeownership. What's his story anyway? Successful, handsome, helpful, why hasn't some smart woman snatched him up yet? I shrugged, pouring myself more tea. He says he's too focused on building his business. Though honestly, I think he enjoys being the devoted uncle figure. He's always talking about how he wants to spoil our future kids rotten. Elizabeth smiled. That's sweet. Family-oriented men are rare these days. After she left around 4, I returned to my design work but found myself distracted by thoughts of family and the future Kirk and I were building together. We'd been married 3 years now, and the topic of children came up more frequently in our conversations. The house certainly had room for expansion. The basement could easily be converted into a family room, and the spare bedroom upstairs would make a perfect nursery. That evening, Kirk came home with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and news that his new client wanted to fast-track their rebranding timeline. It means longer hours for the next few weeks, but the bonus they're offering would really help with our savings goals, he explained as we unpacked pad thai and green curry. Whatever you need to do, I assured him, I can handle things here. I know you can. Though I hate leaving you alone so much, especially with my crazy work schedule ramping up. Kirk paused, twirling noodles around his fork. Actually, I was thinking, maybe I should ask Reggie to check in on you more often while I'm working these long days, just for peace of mind. The suggestion struck me as slightly odd. I'm perfectly safe here, Kirk. We have the best security system in the neighborhood, thanks to your brother's obsession with home protection. I know. It's probably unnecessary, but Reggie offered last week. He said he could easily swing by during his lunch breaks or evening commutes to make sure everything's okay. Kirk reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Humor me? I worry about you being here alone so much. I agreed, though something about the arrangement felt vaguely uncomfortable. Not because I didn't trust Reggie. He'd never been anything but appropriate and respectful. But because it seemed to infantilize my independence. I was a capable adult who'd lived alone for years before marrying Kirk. The idea that I needed regular check-ins felt unnecessary. Still, I could see the genuine concern in Kirk's eyes, and I knew it came from a place of love. His protective instincts had intensified after we'd married, something I attributed to losing his parents so young, and learning to worry about the people he loved most. Of course, I said finally, if it makes you feel better, I'm happy to have Reggie stop by occasionally. Thank you. I just want to know you're safe and happy while I'm building this business for our future. That night, as we settled into bed, Kirk pulled me close and talked excitedly about his expansion plans for the consulting firm. Maybe by next year we'll be ready to start thinking seriously about kids, he mused, his hand resting on my stomach. This house would be perfect for raising a family. I fell asleep feeling grateful for the life we'd built together, surrounded by the quiet security of our Millbrook home and the loving support of Kirk's devoted brother. The future felt bright and full of possibility. How naive I was to think that feeling safe meant actually being safe, or that the people we trust most are incapable of betraying that trust in the most devastating ways imaginable. 3 weeks into Kirk's intensive work schedule, Reggie's daily check-ins had become as routine as my morning coffee. He'd arrive around noon with his easy smile and technological updates, spending 15 or 20 minutes testing various components of our security system before chatting briefly about work or family matters. It was comforting, in a way, having that consistent human contact during the long days when Kirk worked late at the office. On this particular Thursday afternoon in November, I was deep into designing promotional materials for a local bakery's holiday campaign when I heard Reggie's key in the front door. But instead of his usual cheerful greeting, I heard only the soft sound of his footsteps moving through the house with unusual purpose. Reggie, I called from my office. Everything okay? Just running a diagnostic on the basement sensors, his voice drifted back, slightly muffled. Found an anomaly in yesterday's data logs, won't take long. I returned to my work, selecting fonts for a Christmas cookie advertisement. but found myself distracted by the sounds coming from below. Reggie was moving around more than usual, and I could hear what sounded like tools being used, mechanical clicks and soft scraping noises that seemed inconsistent with routine system maintenance. After about 30 minutes, curiosity got the better of me. I saved my design file and headed downstairs to see if Reggie needed any help. The basement was Kirk's domain, filled with his exercise equipment, storage boxes, and the utility systems that kept our house running smoothly. "How's it going down here?" I asked, reaching the bottom of the stairs. Reggie was crouched beside the far wall, near the water heater, with what appeared to be a small electronic device in his hands. When he heard my voice, he straightened quickly, too quickly, and nearly dropped whatever he was holding. "All good," he said, but his usual composure seemed rattled. "Just replacing a sensor battery. These wireless systems need regular maintenance to function properly." Something about his explanation felt off. I'd never seen him replace batteries before, and the device in his hand looked more sophisticated than a simple sensor. It had a small screen and multiple buttons, more like a smartphone or tablet than maintenance equipment. "What kind of sensor is that?" I asked, stepping closer. Reggie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Temperature and humidity monitor. Important for detecting potential water damage or mold issues." He slipped the device into his jacket pocket with practiced efficiency. "Your basement environment is perfect, by the way. No concerns whatsoever." "That's good to hear." I glanced around the basement, noting that everything looked exactly as it always had. "Though I'm surprised you need such high-tech equipment for basic environmental monitoring." "Modern home security is incredibly sophisticated," Reggie replied, gathering his tools. "What used to require multiple devices can now be handled by integrated systems that monitor everything from air quality to structural vibrations." His explanation sounded reasonable, but something in his tone felt rehearsed. And why was he packing up so quickly? Usually, Reggie lingered after completing his maintenance checks, often accepting offers of coffee or sharing stories about his business travels. "Actually, I should head out," he said, confirming my observation. "Conference call with a potential client in 20 minutes. After he left, I remained in the basement, studying the area where he'd been working. Everything appeared normal. The water heater hummed quietly, the electrical panel showed no unusual indicators, and the storage boxes were arranged exactly as Kirk had left them. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That evening, when Kirk arrived home around 8, I mentioned Reggie's maintenance visit. He seemed different today, more rushed than usual, and he was working with some kind of device I'd never seen before. Kirk looked up from his laptop where he was reviewing client presentations. "Different how?" "I don't know exactly. Just not his usual relaxed self, and when I asked about the equipment he was using, his explanation felt practiced, like he'd prepared what to say if someone questioned him." "Claudia, you're probably overthinking this. Reggie's been under a lot of stress lately with some major contracts coming up for renewal. He mentioned last week that he's been working 16-hour days trying to keep ahead of the competition." Kirk's dismissal felt logical, but the uneasy feeling persisted. "Maybe you're right, it just seemed odd." "Besides," Kirk continued, "I trust Reggie completely. He's never given us any reason to doubt his intentions, and everything he's done for us has been incredibly helpful. Remember how he saved us thousands on the roof repair by catching that contractor's inflated estimate?" I nodded, acknowledging the truth of Kirk's words. Reggie had indeed been nothing but supportive and helpful throughout our marriage. My suspicions probably said more about my own stress levels than about any actual problem with his behavior. But that night, as Kirk worked late on his laptop beside me in bed, I found myself listening to the house in a way I never had before. Every creak, every settling sound, every whisper of air through the vents seemed amplified. The security system's occasional beeps, which had always been comforting background noise, now felt intrusive and watchful. Around midnight, I slipped out of bed and walked through the house, ostensibly checking that doors were locked and lights were off. In reality, I was studying our living space with new eyes, looking for anything that seemed out of place or unfamiliar. In the kitchen, I found myself staring at the area near the refrigerator where I'd seen Reggie working weeks earlier. The motion sensor he'd mentioned was visible now that I knew to look for it, a small white device mounted low on the baseboard, barely noticeable unless you were specifically searching. But as I examined it more closely, something struck me as strange. The sensor was positioned to capture movement near the kitchen island and breakfast nook. areas where Kirk and I spent time cooking and eating together. Why would a security system need such detailed monitoring of our daily domestic activities? Standing there in my pajamas at midnight, studying a device installed by someone I trusted implicitly, I felt the first real crack in the foundation of safety I'd built my life upon. It was just a tiny fissure, barely perceptible, but it would soon split wide open to reveal the terrifying truth lurking beneath our peaceful suburban existence. The next morning, I couldn't concentrate on work. Every few minutes I found myself staring at that motion sensor near the refrigerator, trying to rationalize its placement and purpose. Kirk had left early for another client meeting, and the house felt different somehow, less like a sanctuary and more like a space where I was being observed. Around 10 a.m., I made a decision that felt both necessary and slightly ridiculous. I was going to conduct my own investigation of our security system, just to put my mind at ease. If everything was exactly as Reggie claimed, I'd feel foolish but relieved. If something was amiss, at least I'd know I wasn't losing my mind. I started in the kitchen, using my phone's flashlight to examine the motion sensor more closely. The device was indeed professionally installed, with clean wiring that disappeared seamlessly into the wall. But as I studied its positioning, I realized it was angled not toward the doors or windows, where a security sensor would logically focus, but directly toward the breakfast nook where Kirk and I shared our morning coffee and evening conversations. Moving through the house systematically, I began cataloging every security device I could find. The process was more challenging than I'd expected. Reggie had integrated everything so seamlessly that most components were nearly invisible. Small cameras were disguised as smoke detectors, motion sensors were embedded in decorative molding, and tiny microphones were hidden within light fixtures. The sheer quantity was staggering. I counted at least 15 different devices spread throughout our living spaces, including our bedroom and both bathrooms. For a modest 3-bedroom house in a low-crime suburb, the level of surveillance seemed excessive to the point of paranoia. But what disturbed me most was the positioning. Rather than focusing on entry points or potential security vulnerabilities, the cameras and sensors were aimed at areas where Kirk and I spent our private time together. The bedroom camera had a perfect view of our bed. The bathroom sensor could monitor shower and changing activities. Even our home office, where I worked every day, had a small camera tucked behind a picture frame on the bookshelf. I grabbed a notebook and began sketching a rough floor plan, marking the location and apparent focus of each surveillance device. The pattern that emerged was deeply unsettling. Someone could observe virtually every aspect of our daily lives through this network of hidden technology. My hands were shaking as I called Elizabeth, needing to share my discovery with someone I trusted completely. "Claudia? What's wrong? You sound terrible," Elizabeth said immediately upon answering. "I need to talk to someone, and I don't know if I'm being paranoid or if something's really wrong." I explained what I'd discovered about our security system, describing the positioning and quantity of surveillance devices. Elizabeth listened without interruption until I finished. "That's not normal home security, Claudia. Angus and I looked into systems when we moved, and everything you're describing sounds more like professional surveillance than burglary protection. But Reggie installed it all. Why would Kirk's brother want to spy on us? I don't know, but I think you need to find out. Can you access any of the system's settings or recordings?" I hadn't considered that possibility. Reggie set up everything on Kirk's computer. I suppose I could try to access the security interface. "Do it, but be careful. If someone is monitoring you without consent, that's illegal regardless of who's doing it." After ending the call, I went to Kirk's home office and powered up his desktop computer. Finding the security system interface took some searching, but eventually I located a program called Sinclair Home Protection on the desktop. When I clicked on it, a login screen appeared requesting a username and password. I tried several obvious combinations: Kirk's name, our anniversary date, even password and admin, but nothing worked. The system was secured against casual access. However, I noticed something interesting in the program's properties. The software had been installed 3 years ago, just 6 months after we'd moved into the house. But according to my memory, Reggie had only installed our first security upgrade about 18 months ago, following the supposed break-in down the street. This meant surveillance had been in place much longer than I'd realized, probably since we'd first settled into our new home. Every intimate moment Kirk and I had shared as newlyweds, every private conversation, every vulnerable instance of our married life, it had all potentially been recorded and observed. The violation felt so profound that I had to rush to the bathroom to vomit. When the nausea subsided, I sat on the bathroom floor and tried to process what I'd discovered. Someone had been systematically monitoring our lives for years, and the only person with the access and expertise to install such sophisticated surveillance was Reggie. But why? What could he possibly hope to gain from watching his brother's marriage? And more importantly, what was he doing with the recordings? I spent the rest of the afternoon researching home surveillance systems online, trying to understand the capabilities of the equipment I'd identified. What I learned was deeply disturbing. Modern surveillance technology could capture high-definition video and crystal-clear audio from distances that made detection nearly impossible. Some systems could even transmit live feeds to remote locations, meaning someone could watch our activities in real time from anywhere with an internet connection. By evening, when Kirk returned from work, I had made a decision. I needed to tell him what I'd discovered, despite knowing how difficult it would be for him to believe that his beloved brother could betray us so completely. "Kirk, we need to talk about something important," I said as he settled onto the couch with takeout Chinese food. "Sure, what's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation would change everything between us, one way or another. "I think our security system is actually surveillance equipment, and I think Reggie has been spying on us for years." The expression on Kirk's face shifted from confusion to concern to something approaching alarm as the implications of my words began to sink in. Kirk's reaction was exactly what I'd feared. He set down his chopsticks and stared at me as if I'd just announced I believed in alien abductions. "Claudia, that's impossible. Reggie wouldn't do something like that. He's my brother." "I know how it sounds, but hear me out." I retrieved my notebook and floor plan sketches, spreading them across our coffee table. "Look at the positioning of these devices. They're not aimed at doors or windows. They're focused on areas where we spend our private time." Kirk studied my drawings, his expression growing more troubled with each detail I explained. "Even if the positioning seems odd, there could be logical explanations. Maybe Reggie designed the system to monitor our general activities for safety reasons." "Safety from what? And why would he need to watch us in our bedroom and bathroom?" "I don't know, but jumping to surveillance conspiracy theories seems extreme. Reggie has never given us any reason to distrust him." The conversation continued in circles for over an hour, with Kirk defending his brother while I presented my evidence. Finally, exhausted by the emotional strain, I made a suggestion that surprised us both. "What if we ask Elizabeth and Angus to come over and give us an outside perspective?" Elizabeth's nursing background includes some technical training, and Angus deals with medical equipment security at the hospital. They might be able to help us understand whether this setup is normal. Kirk hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with involving outsiders in what felt like a family matter. "I suppose that couldn't hurt, but Claudia, if they confirm that everything is standard home security, will you let this go?" "If they can explain why we need bedroom surveillance for home security, yes." Elizabeth and Angus arrived within an hour of my call. Elizabeth had obviously briefed her husband during the drive, because Angus went straight to examining the devices I'd identified while Elizabeth sat with Kirk and me. "The quantity alone is unusual," Angus said after his initial survey. "Most residential security systems use 4 to 6 sensors maximum. You've got more surveillance equipment than some hospital wards. But could there be legitimate reasons for such comprehensive monitoring?" Kirk asked, still hoping for innocent explanations. Angus pulled out his phone and photographed several of the devices. "I'm not an expert in home security, but I work with monitoring equipment daily. These cameras are significantly more sophisticated than necessary for basic burglary protection. The resolution capabilities and data storage requirements suggest they're designed for detailed observation rather than simple motion detection." Elizabeth had been examining my sketches during Angus's survey. "Claudia, you mentioned that your brother-in-law has keys to the house and access to your computer systems." "Yes, Kirk insisted on giving him emergency access after he helped us through that plumbing crisis last winter. And he works in cybersecurity, so he'd have the technical knowledge to install and operate this kind of surveillance network." Kirk's face was growing paler as the implications accumulated. Reggie's company specializes in corporate security systems. He definitely has the expertise, but that doesn't mean he'd use it inappropriately. Angus returned from the basement looking grim. "I found something down there that's definitely not standard home security." He held up his phone, showing a photograph of a device I hadn't noticed during my earlier investigation. "This is a data storage server," hidden behind your water heater. It's designed to record and archive large quantities of video and audio data. The room fell silent as we processed this discovery. Storage servers weren't components of typical home security systems. They were tools for comprehensive surveillance operations. How much data could something like that store? I asked, dreading the answer. Depending on the configuration, potentially years of continuous recordings, Angus replied. And it's connected to your home internet, which means the data could be accessed remotely or automatically uploaded to external servers. Kirk stood abruptly and began pacing. This can't be happening. There has to be another explanation. Elizabeth reached for his hand. Kirk, I know this is devastating, but you need to consider the possibility that your brother has been violating your privacy. The evidence is pretty compelling. What do we do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what we'd uncovered. First, we document everything thoroughly, Angus suggested. Take detailed photographs of all the equipment and its positioning. Then you need to decide whether to confront Reggie directly or involve law enforcement. Law enforcement? Kirk looked stricken. We're talking about pressing charges against my brother? Unauthorized surveillance in private homes is illegal, Elizabeth said gently. Regardless of family relationships, what's been done here appears to be criminal. As we spent the next 2 hours cataloging evidence, I watched Kirk wrestle with the reality that someone he loved and trusted had betrayed that trust in the most intimate way possible. The brother who'd helped raise him, who'd supported our marriage, who'd been planning to spoil our future children, had been secretly watching our most private moments for years. By midnight, we had comprehensive documentation of the surveillance network. But we still faced the agonizing question of what to do with the truth we'd uncovered. The sleepless night that followed our discovery left Kirk and me emotionally drained but determined to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with. Elizabeth had agreed to help us access the surveillance system's data, using her hospital's cybersecurity protocols as a guide for safe investigation. We need to be methodical about this, she said when she arrived Saturday morning with her laptop and some technical equipment borrowed from Angus. If there's illegal activity happening, we want to preserve evidence properly. Kirk had spent the early morning hours researching the Sinclair home protection software, trying to find any legitimate explanation for its capabilities. What he discovered only deepened our concerns. The program isn't commercially available, he reported, showing us printouts from his internet searches. It's custom software, probably developed specifically for this installation. That level of customization suggests this isn't standard home security. Elizabeth connected her laptop to our home network and began probing the system's architecture. I'm finding multiple data streams feeding into that basement server, she said after an hour of technical work. Video, audio, even internet traffic monitoring. Someone could track every website you visit, every email you send, every online purchase you make. The revelation that our internet activity was also being monitored felt like another layer of violation. Every private message, every personal search, every intimate email between Kirk and me had potentially been recorded and analyzed. How long has this been active? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Elizabeth's fingers flew across her keyboard, accessing log files and system timestamps. Based on the data patterns, continuous monitoring began 3 years and 4 months ago. That coincides with our housewarming party, Kirk finished, his voice hollow. Reggie helped us set up our internet and computer systems that weekend. I remembered that party clearly. It had been a celebration of our new life together, with friends and family touring our home and toasting our future. Reggie had spent much of the evening in the basement and office areas, ostensibly configuring our technology setups. We'd been grateful for his expertise and attention to detail. There's something else, Elizabeth said hesitantly. The system shows regular remote access from external IP addresses. Someone has been actively reviewing the collected data, not just passively recording it. How often? Kirk asked. Daily, sometimes multiple times per day, and there are specific flagged events, moments when the monitoring intensified, intimate conversations, arguments, private discussions about finances or future plans. The idea that someone had been analyzing our relationship dynamics, flagging our most vulnerable moments for special attention, made my skin crawl. This wasn't passive surveillance, it was active psychological study. Elizabeth continued digging through the system logs while Kirk and I sat in stunned silence. After another hour, she made a discovery that changed everything. Claudia, Kirk, you need to see this. Her voice was tight with concern. The surveillance extends beyond your house. The system shows connections to cameras in at least 12 other locations throughout Millbrook and the surrounding communities. Other houses? I whispered. It appears so. The network topology suggests a comprehensive surveillance operation covering multiple residential properties. Your house isn't the only target. It's part of a larger system. Kirk stood and walked to the window overlooking our quiet neighborhood street. You're saying Reggie has been spying on other families too? That's what the data suggests. And based on the file organization, each location has detailed profiles of the residents. Names, schedules, relationship dynamics, personal habits. Elizabeth showed us folder structures on her screen labeled with addresses I recognized. The Abrams family 3 streets over. The Solomons who lived near the elementary school. Even our former neighbors who'd moved to Portland last year. This is massive, I said, trying to comprehend the scope of what we'd uncovered. How many people has he been watching? From what I can see in these logs, potentially dozens of households, and the operation has been running for at least 5 years, predating your surveillance by 18 months. The realization that we weren't Reggie's only victims was somehow both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant his obsession wasn't specifically personal to Kirk and me. Terrifying because it revealed the true extent of his violations and suggested a level of psychological disturbance far beyond anything we'd imagined. We have to go to the police, Kirk said finally, his voice resigned but resolute. This isn't just about us anymore. Other families are being violated, and they don't even know it. Elizabeth nodded, carefully copying relevant files to an encrypted drive. You'll need this evidence, and you'll need to be prepared for the investigation that follows. This kind of systematic surveillance operation will likely involve federal authorities. As we prepared to contact law enforcement, I realized that our quiet suburban life was over. The revelation of Reggie's crimes would inevitably become public, dragging dozens of families into a nightmare they never knew they were living. But there was no choice. The brother Kirk had trusted with our deepest vulnerabilities, had betrayed not just us, but an entire community. Before we contacted the police, Elizabeth suggested we try to access more of the surveillance data to understand exactly what we were dealing with. The authorities will want comprehensive evidence, she explained, and other families deserve to know the full extent of what's been done to them. Using her cybersecurity knowledge, Elizabeth managed to crack deeper into the system's encrypted files. What she found in the hidden directories made our previous discoveries seem almost benign by comparison. There are psychological profiles here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, detailed analyses of each household's vulnerabilities, relationship dynamics, even predictive models for behavior manipulation. Kirk leaned over her shoulder to read the screen, his face growing ashen. That's our file. Subject K and Subject C, Sinclair, he read aloud. Primary vulnerabilities. K's abandonment trauma following parental death, C's isolation from family support system. Optimal manipulation vectors. Financial stress, fertility concerns, home security anxieties. The clinical language describing our most intimate fears and insecurities felt like being dissected while still alive. Reggie hadn't just been watching us, he'd been studying us like laboratory specimens, cataloging our emotional weak points for potential exploitation. It gets worse, Elizabeth said, scrolling through more files. There are intervention scenarios here. Detailed plans for manipulating specific situations to achieve desired outcomes. She opened a document labeled Project Integration, Phase 3, that outlined a systematic plan to gradually increase our dependence on Reggie's support while isolating us from other relationships. The document included timelines for creating artificial crises that would require his intervention, methods for subtly undermining my friendships, and strategies for positioning himself as Kirk's primary confidant and advisor. Look at this. Elizabeth pointed to a section titled Reproductive Timeline Management. He's been tracking my menstrual cycle, our fertility efforts, even our intimate relationship patterns, and he's developed plans to interfere if pregnancy occurs before his integration objectives are complete. I felt physically sick reading about how Reggie had been monitoring the most private aspects of our marriage. The document suggested he'd been prepared to sabotage our attempts to start a family if it conflicted with his psychological manipulation timeline. Kirk discovered an even more disturbing folder labeled Emergency Protocols. Inside were detailed plans for what Reggie called subject extraction, scenarios where he would remove Kirk from our household if I became too suspicious or if outside interference threatened his operation. He's been planning to kidnap you, I said, reading over Kirk's shoulder. If I ever got too close to discovering the truth, he was going to create a crisis that would justify taking you away for your own protection. The extraction scenarios included fabricated medical emergencies, manufactured threats against Kirk's safety, and even plans to have me committed for psychiatric evaluation if I tried to expose the surveillance. Reggie had contingencies for every possible threat to his control over Kirk's life. Elizabeth found evidence that similar integration projects were underway with other families in the surveillance network. The Abrams household, for example, was in Phase 2 with their teenage daughter being groomed for a relationship with one of Reggie's business associates. The Solomon family was targeted for what Reggie called financial integration, gradual manipulation of their investment decisions to create dependence on his guidance. This is like a cult operation, Elizabeth said, reading through more psychological profiles. He's not just spying on people, he's systematically manipulating entire families to increase his control over their lives. We discovered that Reggie had been using the surveillance data for multiple purposes. Beyond the psychological manipulation, he'd been gathering information for business advantages, blackmail material against local officials, and what appeared to be a sophisticated identity theft operation. Financial records showed that he'd been gradually siphoning small amounts from various households' accounts, amounts so minor they'd go unnoticed but collectively generating significant income. He'd also been using personal information gathered through surveillance to access credit reports, insurance policies, and other sensitive financial data. But perhaps most disturbing was a folder labeled Future Generations. It contained detailed plans for extending his surveillance and manipulation networks to the children of his current targets. Reggie envisioned creating a multi-generational system of control, with families unknowingly raising their children under his observation and influence. He's not just a predator, Kirk said quietly, staring at the evidence of his brother's systematic exploitation. He's building some kind of empire of control over our entire community. The scope of Reggie's operation was staggering. For years he'd been positioning himself as the helpful neighbor, the reliable family friend, the trusted advisor, all while secretly orchestrating the lives of dozens of families according to his own twisted vision of social control. As we compiled the evidence, I realized that we'd stumbled onto something far more sinister than simple voyeurism or family dysfunction. Reggie Sinclair had been conducting what amounted to a large-scale psychological experiment on our community, treating real families like chess pieces in some elaborate game of manipulation and control. The question now was whether we could stop him before he realized we'd discovered his secret empire. The weight of what we'd discovered pressed down on us like a physical burden. Sitting in our living room with evidence of Reggie's massive surveillance and manipulation network spread across our coffee table, Kirk and I faced an impossible choice. We had the power to expose crimes that affected dozens of families, but doing so would destroy the only family Kirk had left and likely tear apart our entire community. I keep thinking there has to be another explanation, Kirk said for the 100th time, running his hands through his hair. Maybe it's some kind of security research project, or he's working with law enforcement on something classified. Elizabeth looked up from her laptop, where she'd been documenting more evidence. Kirk, I understand this is devastating, but the psychological profiles and manipulation scenarios aren't consistent with any legitimate research or law enforcement operation. This is predatory behavior on a massive scale. He raised me, Kirk whispered, his voice breaking. When our parents died, Reggie gave up his own plans to make sure I could finish college. He's been at every important moment of my life. How do I reconcile that man with this monster? I moved closer to Kirk on the couch, taking his hand. Maybe that's exactly why he did all this. Not out of love, but out of a need to control. Maybe losing your parents triggered something in him that made him determine he'd never lose control over anyone important to him again. The psychological implications were staggering. Reggie had spent years building an elaborate illusion of being the perfect supportive brother, while secretly orchestrating every aspect of Kirk's adult life. The business connections that had helped Kirk's consulting firm succeed, the house he'd helped us find and purchase, even our social relationships, all of it had been carefully managed to keep Kirk dependent and under observation. What about the other families? I asked, thinking about our neighbors who had no idea they were living under surveillance. The Abrams' teenage daughter, the Solomon family's finances, all those children he's been watching grow up. Don't they deserve to know what's been done to them? Kirk nodded slowly, wrestling with competing loyalties. I know they do. It's just, Once we expose this, there's no going back. Reggie will go to prison, our family will be destroyed, and every personal detail of our lives will become evidence in a criminal trial. Elizabeth had been quietly reviewing more files while we talked. There's something else you need to consider, she said reluctantly. Based on these surveillance logs, Reggie has been escalating his interventions lately. The frequency of his visits to your house has increased, and there are notes about accelerating timeline objectives. I think he's planning something significant. She showed us a recent document labeled Integration Acceleration Protocol that outlined plans to create a major crisis requiring Reggie's direct intervention in our lives. The scenarios ranged from manufactured emergencies that would force us to stay with him temporarily, to more extreme measures involving false accusations or psychiatric evaluations. He's running out of patience with the gradual approach, Elizabeth explained. These notes suggest he's preparing to take more direct control over your relationship and living situation. The timeline in the document indicated that Reggie was planning to implement his acceleration protocol within the next few weeks. Reading between the lines of his clinical language, it appeared he was preparing to separate Kirk and me permanently, using fabricated evidence of my supposed psychological instability or threat to Kirk's well-being. We can't wait, I said, the urgency of our situation finally crystallizing. If Reggie realizes we've discovered his surveillance, or if he moves forward with this acceleration plan, we could lose our chance to stop him. Kirk stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street where we'd lived peacefully for 4 years, unaware that our lives were being orchestrated by the person we trusted most. I know you're right. I just never imagined I'd have to choose between protecting my marriage and destroying my brother. You're not destroying him, Elizabeth said gently. You're stopping him from destroying others. The manipulation and surveillance documented here shows he's been destroying lives for years, just slowly and carefully enough that his victims didn't realize it was happening. As afternoon turned to evening, we continued wrestling with the moral complexity of our situation. Every piece of evidence pointed to Reggie as a sophisticated predator who'd been exploiting our community's trust for years, yet Kirk's emotional connection to his brother made the decision to expose him feel like a betrayal of family loyalty. What if we give him a chance to explain? Kirk suggested desperately. Maybe confront him privately before involving the authorities. Absolutely not, Elizabeth said firmly. These files show he's prepared for the possibility of discovery. Confronting him directly would give him the opportunity to destroy evidence, flee, or implement those emergency protocols designed to discredit you both. As darkness fell, we finally reached a decision. The evidence was too compelling, the threat to other families too serious, and the risk of Reggie's escalation too imminent to allow family sentiment to override moral obligation. We would contact the police first thing in the morning. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching our somber mood as we prepared to contact the authorities. Elizabeth had stayed overnight to help us organize the evidence, and we'd spent hours creating a comprehensive presentation of Reggie's surveillance network for law enforcement. Just as I was printing the final documents, my phone buzzed with a text message from Reggie himself. Morning. Mind if I swing by around 10? Want to check on some system updates from yesterday's maintenance window. The timing felt too coincidental to be innocent. Kirk and I exchanged alarmed glances as we realized Reggie might already suspect something was wrong. We need to act normal, Elizabeth whispered, though her face had gone pale. If he's monitoring your communications, any unusual behavior could trigger those emergency protocols we found. Kirk's hands were shaking as he typed a response. Sure, see you then. We had less than an hour to hide all evidence of our investigation. Elizabeth quickly transferred her laptop and technical equipment to her car, while I gathered the printed files and surveillance documentation. Kirk restored his computer to its original state, clearing browser histories and ensuring no trace of our discovery remained visible. At exactly 10 a.m., we heard Reggie's key in the front door. His familiar voice called out, but something in his tone seemed different, more probing, more alert. Good morning, family, he said, entering the living room with his usual smile, though his eyes immediately began scanning the space with unusual intensity. How was your weekend? Quiet, I replied, forcing myself to sound relaxed. Just caught up on some design work and did some cleaning. Reggie nodded, but I noticed he was studying my face carefully, as if analyzing my expression for signs of deception. Kirk mentioned you've been feeling a bit anxious lately about home security. Everything okay? The question caught me off guard. Kirk and I hadn't discussed any security concerns with him recently, which meant he'd either overheard a private conversation through his surveillance system or was fishing for information. "I'm fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just the usual worries about being alone so much while Kirk's working long hours." "Of course, that's completely understandable." Reggie's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in his eyes. "Actually, that's partly why I wanted to stop by. I've been thinking about upgrading your bedroom sensor to include audio monitoring, in case of medical emergencies or break-in attempts." The casual way he suggested adding audio surveillance to our bedroom made my stomach turn. This was exactly the kind of escalation Elizabeth had warned us about. Reggie was preparing to increase his monitoring capabilities under the guise of enhanced security. Kirk cleared his throat nervously. "That seems like overkill, Reggie. We're pretty comfortable with the current setup." For just a moment, Reggie's facade slipped. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and his gaze sharpened with what looked like irritation or suspicion. Of course. Just a suggestion. I tend to get carried away with the latest security innovations." He pulled out his tablet and began what appeared to be routine system diagnostics. "Mind if I run a quick check on the network performance while I'm here?" I watched with growing alarm as Reggie accessed the surveillance system, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. From my angle, I could see him reviewing what looked like recent activity logs, the same logs that would show Elizabeth's intrusion into the system yesterday. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Reggie studied his tablet, occasionally glancing up at Kirk and me with an expression that was becoming increasingly calculating. I could practically see him processing anomalies in the data, comparing them against our claimed weekend activities. "Interesting," he murmured, not looking up from the screen. "The system shows some unusual network traffic yesterday afternoon. High bandwidth data access that doesn't match your typical internet usage patterns." My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. "We streamed a few movies," I said quickly. "Maybe that's what you're seeing." Reggie's eyes met mine directly, and for the first time in 4 years, I saw him without his carefully constructed mask of benevolence. The cold intelligence behind his gaze was terrifying. This was a predator who'd been studying us like prey animals, learning our weaknesses and planning our manipulation with scientific precision. "Movies," he repeated slowly, as if testing the explanation. "Of course, though the data patterns suggest more of a system analysis than entertainment streaming." He set down the tablet and leaned forward slightly. "Claudia, you haven't been having any concerns about our security setup, have you? Sometimes people can develop paranoid thoughts about technology they don't fully understand." The way he said paranoid thoughts sent chills down my spine. This was the beginning of the psychological manipulation we'd read about in his files, the process of making me question my own perception and sanity. "No concerns at all," I managed to say. "I trust your expertise completely." But Reggie was no longer fooled by our performance. I could see in his expression that he knew we'd discovered something, and he was already calculating his response to this unexpected threat to his carefully constructed empire of control. Reggie's visit ended with uncomfortable pleasantries, but the damage was done. He knew we suspected something, and we knew he knew. The careful balance of deception that had protected us during our investigation was crumbling rapidly. Within 2 hours of his departure, the first sign of his retaliation appeared. Kirk received a call from his biggest client, the tech startup whose contract had been the foundation of his recent business success. "They're terminating our agreement," Kirk said after hanging up, his face pale with shock. "Effective immediately. They claim there are concerns about data security and professional reliability." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. They wouldn't give specifics, just said they'd received information that made them question our ability to handle sensitive projects. Kirk sat heavily on the couch. "This doesn't make sense, Claudia. The project was going perfectly. We were ahead of schedule and under budget." I felt sick as the implications became clear. Reggie's cybersecurity company regularly worked with tech firms throughout Portland. He had the professional relationships and industry credibility to destroy Kirk's reputation with a few carefully placed phone calls. The second attack came that afternoon. I was working on a design project when my laptop suddenly displayed a security warning claiming my system had been infected with malware. When I tried to access my client files, everything was corrupted or missing. 3 years of carefully organized work, portfolio pieces, client contacts, ongoing projects had been wiped clean. "It's not malware," Elizabeth confirmed when I called her in panic. "This is deliberate sabotage. Someone with sophisticated access deleted your files and installed software to prevent recovery. By evening, Reggie's campaign of retaliation was escalating beyond professional sabotage. Our home internet service was mysteriously disconnected, with the provider claiming suspicious activity on our account required investigation. Our credit cards were suddenly flagged for fraud, freezing our access to funds. Even our cell phone service experienced unexplained disruptions. He's isolating us, Kirk realized, as we sat in our living room, surrounded by the evidence of Reggie's systematic attack on our lives, cutting off our income, our communications, our financial resources, just like those integration scenarios we found in his files. The psychological pressure was intense. Every system we relied on for normal functioning was either compromised or threatened. Reggie was demonstrating the full extent of his power over our lives while maintaining plausible deniability. Everything could be explained as unfortunate coincidences or technical problems. That night, as we tried to sleep despite our growing anxiety, I heard sounds from the basement, soft footsteps, electronic beeping, the subtle noise of equipment being moved. Someone was in our house. I woke Kirk silently, gesturing toward the basement stairs. We both listened as the sounds continued. Careful, deliberate movement by someone who knew exactly where everything was located. "He's using his key," Kirk whispered, the betrayal evident in his voice. "He's in our house right now." We huddled in our bedroom, afraid to confront Reggie directly but unable to ignore his presence below us. For over an hour we heard him moving through the basement and first floor, apparently adjusting or removing surveillance equipment. When the sounds finally stopped and we heard the front door close, Kirk and I crept downstairs to assess what had changed. The surveillance devices we'd identified were gone, leaving only tiny holes and slight discoloration where they'd been mounted. But I suspected this wasn't Reggie removing evidence. It was him upgrading to equipment we wouldn't be able to find or detect. The next morning brought a new form of psychological warfare. Kirk received a call from Detective Sarah Madeline of the Millbrook Police Department, requesting that we come in for questioning regarding concerns about domestic stability that had been reported by a family member. "What kind of concerns?" Kirk asked, though we both already knew who had made the report. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person," Detective Madeline replied. "Can you both come in this afternoon?" At the police station, we learned that Reggie had filed a formal report expressing concern about my mental health and its impact on Kirk's well-being. He'd presented what he claimed was evidence of erratic behavior, paranoid delusions about surveillance, and potential threats to Kirk's safety. Mr. Sinclair provided documentation of concerning communications and behavioral patterns, Detective Madeline explained. He's requesting a welfare check and possible intervention for what he describes as escalating psychological distress. The irony was devastating. Reggie was using the very system we'd hoped would protect us against him, leveraging his reputation and fabricated evidence to paint me as unstable and dangerous. The police officer who should have been investigating his crimes was instead questioning my mental state based on his manipulative report. "These are serious allegations," Detective Madeline continued. "Domestic situations involving psychological distress can escalate quickly. We need to understand the full scope of what's happening in your household." As Kirk and I tried to defend ourselves against Reggie's false accusations, I realized we were experiencing exactly what his emergency protocols had outlined: systematic discrediting designed to neutralize our ability to expose his crimes. The predator had become the protector in the eyes of law enforcement, while his victims were being positioned as the real threat to community safety. Detective Madeline's interview lasted 3 hours and felt more like an interrogation than a welfare check. Every answer Kirk and I provided about our relationship, our concerns about surveillance, and our discovery of Reggie's activities was met with skepticism and carefully worded questions designed to elicit admissions of mental instability. "Mrs. Sinclair, your brother-in-law indicates you've become increasingly paranoid about technology in your home," Detective Madeline said, consulting notes from Reggie's report. "He mentions you've accused him of installing hidden cameras and monitoring your activities. Can you explain these concerns?" I tried to describe our discovery of the surveillance network, but without the physical evidence, which Reggie had removed during his midnight visit. My explanation sounded exactly like the paranoid delusions he'd claimed they were. "We documented everything," Kirk interjected. "My friend Elizabeth helped us analyze the system and found evidence of illegal surveillance affecting multiple households." "Where is this documentation now?" Detective Madeline asked. "At Elizabeth's house. We moved it there for safekeeping when we realized Reggie suspected our investigation. The detective made notes, but her expression remained skeptical. Mr. Sinclair has provided character references from several community members who describe him as a trusted businessman and devoted family member. He's also shown us communications where he expresses genuine concern about Mrs. Sinclair's well-being and its impact on your marriage. Those communications were undoubtedly fabricated or manipulated, but we had no way to prove it. Reggie had spent years building his reputation as the perfect neighbor and brother, while systematically positioning himself to discredit anyone who might threaten his operation. "Can we speak with Elizabeth Hawthorne?" I asked. "She can verify everything we've told you." "We'll be interviewing Miss Hawthorne as part of our investigation," Detective Madeline confirmed. "However, I should mention that Mr. Sinclair has expressed concerns about her influence on your mental state. He suggests she may be enabling paranoid behaviors rather than encouraging professional help." My heart sank as I realized Reggie had anticipated our reliance on Elizabeth's support and had already begun undermining her credibility. In his version of events, she wasn't a trusted friend helping us uncover crimes. She was a negative influence feeding my delusions. The interview concluded with Detective Madeline recommending that I undergo voluntary psychological evaluation to address what she termed stress-related concerns affecting family dynamics. While not legally required, her tone made clear that refusing would be viewed as evidence of the mental instability Reggie had described. "We're also recommending temporary separation while these issues are resolved," she added. "Mr. Sinclair has offered to provide housing for Kirk during this period to ensure his safety and well-being." The trap was perfectly constructed. Reggie had maneuvered the police into recommending exactly what his integration protocols had outlined, separating Kirk and me while positioning himself as the solution to our manufactured crisis. "I'm not leaving my wife," Kirk said firmly, "and Claudia doesn't need psychological evaluation. She needs protection from someone who's been systematically violating our privacy and manipulating our lives." Detective Madeline's expression hardened. "Mr. Sinclair, domestic situations involving mental health crises can be unpredictable. Your brother's concerns may seem intrusive, but they appear to come from genuine care for your well-being." As we left the police station, I felt the full weight of Reggie's strategic planning. He'd spent years building the reputation and relationships necessary to turn the system against us when we discovered his crimes. Every authority figure we might turn to for help had been preconditioned to view him as trustworthy and us as unstable. Our next attempt at getting help came through Kirk's uncle Archie Solomon, his father's younger brother who lived in Seattle. Archie was a retired federal prosecutor who we hoped might understand the legal implications of what we'd uncovered. "This is serious," Archie said after we drove to Seattle to show him Elizabeth's evidence files. "If even half of what you've documented is accurate, Reggie is operating a criminal enterprise that violates federal surveillance and privacy laws." For the first time since our nightmare began, we felt hope that someone in authority might take our concerns seriously. "However," Archie continued, his expression troubled, "I received a call from Reggie yesterday. He's very concerned about both of you, particularly Claudia's mental state. He mentioned that you've been making increasingly bizarre accusations and that he's worried about Kirk's safety." Even Archie, family who should have been naturally sympathetic to Kirk, had been compromised by Reggie's preemptive narrative. The call had been perfectly timed to plant seeds of doubt before we could present our evidence. "Uncle Archie, you've known me my entire life," Kirk pleaded. "Do I seem unstable or dangerous to you?" "Of course not, Kirk, but trauma and stress can manifest in unexpected ways, and Reggie showed me some communications that were concerning." Those communications were undoubtedly fabricated, but Archie's legal training made him cautious about accepting our claims without corroborating evidence. He agreed to review our documentation but warned that the case would be difficult to prosecute given Reggie's reputation and the absence of physical evidence. As we drove back to Millbrook that evening, the reality of our situation became clear. Reggie had spent years preparing for the possibility of discovery, creating a network of relationships and false narratives that turned every potential source of help into another weapon against us. We were fighting not just one man, but an entire system he'd carefully constructed to protect himself and destroy anyone who threatened his empire of control. 2 days after our failed attempt to get help from Uncle Archie, Reggie abandoned all pretense of subtlety. The psychological warfare escalated to direct action that left no doubt about his intentions or capabilities. It started when Kirk arrived at his office downtown to find the building's security guards waiting with a restraining order. His own business partner, Madeline Abrams, stood behind them with an expression of barely concealed fear. "I'm sorry, Kirk," Madeline said as the guards escorted him from the building. "But after what Reggie told me about Claudia's behavior and the threats she's been making, I can't risk having you here while this situation is unresolved." Kirk stared at her in shock. "What threats? Claudia hasn't threatened anyone." "The recordings Reggie played for me suggest otherwise. Claudia threatening to harm him if he doesn't stop his imaginary surveillance. You talking about wanting to destroy your brother for trying to help you." Madeline shook her head sadly. "I've known Reggie for years through the business community. He's genuinely terrified about what you two might do next. The recordings were obviously fabricated or manipulated, but they were convincing enough to cost Kirk his business partnership and access to his own office." Within hours, word had spread through their professional network that Kirk Sinclair was involved in a domestic crisis involving threats against his brother. Meanwhile, I discovered that my own professional reputation was under similar attack. 3 of my regular clients canceled their contracts that morning, citing concerns about reliability and professional stability. When I called to ask for specifics, they mentioned receiving anonymous tips about my mental health issues and potential impact on their projects. By afternoon, our isolation was nearly complete. Friends stopped returning calls, neighbors avoided eye contact, and even our grocery store began treating us with suspicious wariness. Reggie had systematically poisoned our entire social and professional network with his fabricated narrative of our supposed psychological deterioration. The escalation reached a terrifying new level that evening when I returned from a grocery run to find Kirk pacing frantically in our living room. "He took our medical records," Kirk said without preamble. "Reggie somehow accessed our health insurance accounts and downloaded years of medical history. Then he called Dr. Patricia Solomon at the clinic and expressed concerns about your psychological state based on what he claimed to have found." Dr. Solomon was our family physician, someone who'd known us for 3 years and had never observed any signs of mental health issues. But Reggie's call had planted enough doubt that she'd requested an immediate appointment to assess any developing concerns. "He's building a medical case against me," I realized with growing horror. First the police report, then the professional sabotage, now medical documentation. He's creating an official record of instability that will justify whatever he plans to do next. Kirk's phone rang, displaying Reggie's name. For a moment we stared at it, then Kirk answered with grim determination. "Hello, Reggie." "Kirk, thank God you answered. I've been so worried about both of you." Reggie's voice carried what sounded like genuine concern, though we now recognized it as masterful acting. "I think it's time we talked about getting Claudia the help she needs." "Claudia doesn't need help. She needs protection from you. I understand you feel that way, but the evidence suggests otherwise. The paranoid accusations, the threats, the impact on your business relationships, these are serious symptoms that require professional intervention." Kirk put the call on speaker so I could hear Reggie's carefully constructed manipulation. Every word was designed to reinforce his narrative while appearing compassionate and reasonable. "I've arranged for a consultation with Dr. Elsa Hawthorne at the Pacific Mental Health Center," Reggie continued. "She's an expert in stress-induced psychological episodes and paranoid disorders. I think a voluntary evaluation could really help Claudia work through these difficulties." The suggestion of voluntary evaluation carried an obvious threat: comply willingly or face involuntary commitment based on the evidence he'd been manufacturing. "And Kirk, I want you to know that you're welcome to stay with me while Claudia gets the treatment she needs. Your business partnership with Madeline doesn't have to be permanent. I can help you rebuild your professional relationships once this crisis is resolved." It was a perfect trap. Reggie was offering Kirk everything he'd lost: business opportunities, social standing, family support, in exchange for abandoning me to psychological evaluation and probable institutionalization. "I'm not leaving my wife," Kirk said firmly, "and I'm not pretending that your surveillance and manipulation are symptoms of her mental illness." The line was quiet for a long moment. When Reggie spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "That's unfortunate, Kirk. I'd hoped we could resolve this situation amicably, but if you won't accept help voluntarily, other measures may become necessary." "What kind of measures?" "The kind that prioritize your safety over your preferences. I have a responsibility to protect you, even from yourself if necessary." The call ended, leaving us staring at each other in the silence of our violated home. Reggie had just threatened to take direct action against both of us, and we had nowhere left to turn for help. That night, as Kirk and I huddled in our bedroom with chairs barricaded against the door, we made a decision that felt both desperate and necessary. If the local authorities wouldn't listen to us, and if Reggie had compromised every traditional avenue for help, we would have to take our evidence directly to the media and federal authorities simultaneously. "We're only going to get one chance at this," Kirk said, his voice steady despite the gravity of our situation. "Once we go public, Reggie will know we're fighting back with everything we have. He'll either be forced to retreat or escalate to his most extreme contingency plans." Elizabeth had been staying at a hotel since our investigation began, afraid that her association with us might make her a target for Reggie's retaliation. We called her secure line at 2 a.m. to coordinate our final gambit. "I've been working on this since our last conversation," she said. "I managed to recover more data from the surveillance network before Reggie locked down access. The evidence is even more damning than what we found initially." She'd discovered that Reggie's operation extended far beyond Millbrook. His surveillance network included households in at least 6 different communities across Oregon and Washington, affecting hundreds of families who had no idea their lives were being monitored and manipulated. "There's also evidence of coordination with other individuals," Elizabeth continued. "Reggie isn't working alone. There's a network of people involved in this surveillance operation, including some who appear to be working in law enforcement and medical fields." The revelation that Reggie had accomplices explained how he'd been able to manipulate official systems so effectively. Detective Madeline's quick acceptance of his accusations, Dr. Solomon's willingness to question my mental health, even the business community's rapid spread of rumors about our instability, all of it suggested coordinated effort rather than individual manipulation. "We need to contact the FBI directly," Kirk decided. "This crosses state lines and involves systematic violation of federal privacy laws. Local authorities might be compromised, but federal agents would have the resources to investigate properly." Elizabeth had already prepared a comprehensive evidence package, including recovered surveillance data, documentation of manipulation protocols, financial records showing illegal access to multiple bank accounts, and communication logs proving coordination between multiple perpetrators. "I'm driving to Portland right now," she said. "There's a 24-hour FBI field office downtown. If I can get this evidence to them before Reggie realizes what we're doing, they might be able to act quickly enough to prevent him from destroying more evidence or implementing those emergency protocols." While Elizabeth headed to the FBI, Kirk and I prepared our media strategy. We'd identified 3 investigative journalists known for covering privacy violations and surveillance abuses, one at the Oregonian, one at a national magazine, and one who specialized in exposing corporate misconduct. Our plan was to simultaneously contact all 3 journalists with our story, ensuring that even if Reggie tried to suppress coverage, multiple outlets would have the information. We'd learned from his manipulation tactics that controlling narrative required coordinating multiple information sources. At dawn, we began making our calls. The journalist at the Oregonian, Amanda Sinclair, ironically sharing Reggie's surname, showed immediate interest in our story. "I've been investigating similar patterns of surveillance abuse in tech communities," she said. "Your evidence fits with some concerning trends I've been tracking. Can you get me documentation within the next few hours?" By 7 a.m., we'd connected with all 3 journalists and transmitted Elizabeth's evidence files through encrypted channels. Each reporter confirmed they would begin immediate investigation and fact-checking, with publication possible within 24 to 48 hours. But Reggie was faster than we'd anticipated. At 8 a.m., Kirk received a call from Uncle Archie in Seattle. "Kirk, I just got a very disturbing call from emergency services in Millbrook. They've received reports that Claudia is experiencing a severe psychological breakdown and may be dangerous to herself or others. They're requesting that I help locate you both for immediate intervention." "Uncle Archie, that's exactly what we warned you about. Reggie is manipulating the system to have Claudia committed so he can separate us. The reports are coming from multiple sources, Kirk, not just Reggie. Your family doctor, a business associate, even some neighbors have expressed concerns about erratic behavior and potential violence." We realized that Reggie's network of accomplices was implementing the emergency protocols we'd found in his files. Multiple fabricated reports from seemingly independent sources would give authorities justification for forced intervention, making our claims of conspiracy seem even more paranoid. "Don't come home," Uncle Archie warned. "There's an active search underway, and mental health crisis teams are being dispatched. If Claudia really is experiencing psychological distress, voluntary treatment would be much better than forced intervention. As we ended the call, sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer. Through our bedroom window, we saw police cars and what appeared to be a medical response vehicle turning onto our street. "They're coming," Kirk said, his voice tight with fear and determination. "Everything depends on whether Elizabeth reached the FBI in time, and whether our media contacts can get this story out before Reggie completely destroys our credibility." We had perhaps minutes before our house would be surrounded by authorities convinced we were dangerous and unstable, armed with fabricated evidence of our supposed psychological deterioration. The desperate gambit was in motion, but we wouldn't know if it had succeeded until we were either vindicated or destroyed by the system Reggie had turned against us. The police vehicles stopped 3 houses down from ours, and we watched through our bedroom window as uniformed officers consulted with what appeared to be mental health crisis intervention specialists. They were clearly preparing for a volatile situation based on whatever reports Reggie and his accomplices had filed about my supposed psychological breakdown. But just as the team began moving toward our house, one of the officers received a radio call that changed everything. We couldn't hear the conversation, but we saw him gesture urgently to his colleagues, pointing back toward their vehicles. Within minutes, the entire response team was retreating, leaving our street as quiet as it had been before. Kirk's phone rang immediately. It was Elizabeth, calling from the FBI field office in Portland. "They're moving," she said, her voice tight with exhaustion and relief. "Federal agents are coordinating with state and local authorities right now. The evidence was compelling enough that they've issued immediate search warrants for Reggie's home, business, and all associated properties." The timing had been crucial. Elizabeth's arrival at the FBI office had coincided with an ongoing federal investigation into privacy violations by cybersecurity firms. Our evidence provided the missing pieces that connected scattered reports of surveillance abuse across multiple states. "Agent David Hawthorne is leading the investigation," Elizabeth continued. "He's requesting that you both come to the federal building immediately for protective custody and formal interviews. They're treating this as a potential organized crime operation involving multiple victims across state lines." As we prepared to leave for Portland, Kirk received another call, this one from Amanda Sinclair at the Oregonian. "I've been working all night to verify your claims," she said. "I can confirm that at least 12 families in the Millbrook area have been affected by unauthorized surveillance. 3 other households discovered hidden cameras after reading about your situation." This story is breaking in today's online edition. The article titled "Millbrook Surveillance Scandal: Families Discover Years of Hidden Monitoring" included interviews with neighbors who'd found similar camera installations and quotes from cybersecurity experts confirming the illegal nature of the surveillance network. Within hours, the story had been picked up by regional and national outlets. The narrative that Reggie had spent weeks constructing, portraying us as mentally unstable and dangerous, crumbled under the weight of corroborating evidence from multiple independent sources. By noon, as we sat in the FBI field office providing detailed statements, news crews were broadcasting live from our neighborhood. The carefully maintained facade of Millbrook's quiet suburban security had been shattered by revelations of systematic surveillance and manipulation affecting dozens of families. Agent Hawthorne showed us surveillance footage that FBI technicians had recovered from Reggie's business premises. The scope of the operation was even more extensive than we'd realized. High-definition cameras, professional audio equipment, and sophisticated data analysis software that could track behavioral patterns and predict personal vulnerabilities. "We've identified at least 47 households under active surveillance," Agent Hawthorne reported. "The operation appears to have generated significant income through identity theft, blackmail, and manipulation of investment decisions. Your brother-in-law wasn't just violating privacy, he was running a criminal enterprise." The FBI had also uncovered evidence of Reggie's accomplice network, including corrupt contacts in local law enforcement, medical professionals who provided false evaluations, and business associates who helped destroy targets' professional reputations when they became suspicious. Detective Sarah Madeline, who had been so skeptical of our claims just days earlier, was among those being investigated for accepting bribes in exchange for dismissing surveillance complaints and filing false reports about victims' mental health. As the investigation unfolded throughout the day, Kirk and I watched news coverage that vindicated every claim we'd made while exposing the full extent of Reggie's manipulation. Neighbors we'd known for years appeared on camera describing their shock at discovering hidden cameras in their homes. Business leaders expressed outrage at learning their professional decisions had been influenced by fabricated information. The psychological impact on our community was devastating. Families who'd trusted Reggie with their home security, their business relationships, even their children's safety, now had to confront the reality that their most private moments had been observed and analyzed for years. But perhaps most disturbing were the interviews with Dr. Elsa Hawthorne from the Pacific Mental Health Center, who admitted to federal investigators that she'd been paid to provide psychological evaluations supporting involuntary commitments based on fabricated evidence. Mr. Sinclair presented himself as a concerned family member seeking help for relatives experiencing psychological distress, she confessed. I never questioned the authenticity of the behavioral reports he provided, because his reputation in the community was impeccable. The revelation that medical professionals had been corrupted as part of Reggie's manipulation network sent shockwaves through Oregon's healthcare community and prompted immediate reviews of involuntary commitment procedures. As evening approached, federal agents reported that Reggie had been arrested while attempting to flee to Canada. His business premises had yielded terabytes of surveillance data, detailed psychological profiles of hundreds of victims, and financial records documenting years of systematic exploitation. The truth was finally public. Our innocence was established, and the man who'd tried to destroy our lives was facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison. But the damage to our community, and to our own sense of safety and trust, would take much longer to heal. Reggie's arrest at the Canadian border became front-page news across the Pacific Northwest. The image of him in handcuffs, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled, and his confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic, marked the dramatic end of his years-long deception. The evidence seized from his business and personal properties painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise that shocked even experienced federal investigators. Agent Hawthorne briefed us on the scope of what they'd uncovered as Reggie awaited trial. Your brother-in-law maintained detailed psychological profiles on over 200 individuals, Agent Hawthorne explained. He'd categorized people by vulnerability types, financial stress, relationship problems, health issues, family conflicts. Then he'd systematically exploit those vulnerabilities for profit or control. The financial component of Reggie's operation was staggering. Over 5 years, he'd stolen more than $3 million through identity theft, investment manipulation, and fraudulent insurance claims. He'd been particularly skilled at small-scale theft that wouldn't trigger immediate attention, skimming a few $100s monthly from dozens of accounts rather than making obvious large withdrawals. But the psychological manipulation had been even more extensive than the financial crimes. Reggie had been orchestrating major life decisions for his surveillance targets, steering them toward choices that increased his control or financial benefit. The Abrams family's decision to refinance their home through Reggie's recommended lender cost them $30,000 in unnecessary fees, Agent Hawthorne detailed. The Solomon family's investment in what they thought was a promising startup was actually a shell company designed to transfer their retirement savings to accounts Reggie controlled. Kirk sat beside me in the FBI conference room, struggling to process the extent of his brother's betrayal. How many families lost money because they trusted him? We're still calculating the full financial impact, but preliminary estimates suggest over 40 families suffered significant losses. Some lost college funds for their children, others had their retirement savings depleted. A few elderly victims lost their homes entirely. The human cost was even more devastating than the financial damage. Several marriages had ended due to artificial crises Reggie had orchestrated. Teenagers had been manipulated into destructive relationships. Children had been psychologically damaged by surveillance they never knew existed. Dr. Patricia Solomon, who had been drawn into Reggie's web of medical accomplices, provided testimony that revealed the depth of his manipulation tactics. He would present detailed behavioral observations that seemed to indicate serious psychological problems, she explained to investigators. The documentation appeared professional and comprehensive. I never suspected the observations were fabricated or that the concerning behaviors had been artificially induced through manipulation. Reggie had been particularly skilled at creating medical emergencies that justified intervention in his targets' lives. Heart palpitations caused by stress he'd deliberately created. Anxiety attacks triggered by manufactured financial crises. Depression resulting from isolation he'd systematically engineered. The trial preparation revealed that Reggie's criminal network extended far beyond Millbrook. FBI investigations in Washington, California, and Idaho uncovered similar surveillance operations targeting affluent suburban communities. Reggie had been franchising his methods to other predators, teaching them how to establish themselves as trusted community members while secretly exploiting their neighbors. This wasn't just one disturbed individual, Agent Hawthorne explained. This was an organized criminal enterprise with sophisticated methods for identifying, targeting, and exploiting vulnerable populations. The cascade of arrests following Reggie's capture dismantled an entire network of corruption. Detective Sarah Madeline was charged with accepting bribes and filing false reports. Dr. Elsa Hawthorne faced medical board sanctions and criminal charges for providing fraudulent psychological evaluations. 3 other business leaders in Reggie's network were arrested for money laundering and conspiracy. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered Reggie's long-term plans. In encrypted files on his personal computer, they found detailed scenarios for expanding his operation into what he called community integration protocols. He was planning to establish similar networks in at least 12 other communities, Agent Hawthorne revealed. The goal was to create a region-wide surveillance and manipulation system that could influence local elections, business decisions, even school board policies. Reggie's vision had been nothing short of social engineering on a massive scale, using surveillance and psychological manipulation to shape entire communities according to his preferences and profit motives. When Kirk and I were finally allowed to confront Reggie during his interrogation, the man we saw bore little resemblance to the caring brother-in-law we'd known for years. Prison clothing and federal custody had stripped away his polished facade, revealing the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath his charm. "You don't understand what I was building," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth that had once made him so convincing. "I was creating stability, structure, purpose. These people needed guidance. Their lives were chaotic and wasteful until I provided direction." Kirk stared at his brother with a mixture of horror and pity. "You destroyed families, Reggie. You stole money from children's college funds. You manipulated people into making decisions that ruined their lives." "I optimized their outcomes," Reggie replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "My interventions prevented worse disasters. My guidance improved their financial situations. My monitoring ensured their safety." Even facing federal charges and overwhelming evidence, Reggie remained convinced that his crimes had been acts of benevolence. The delusion was so complete that he seemed genuinely puzzled by our inability to appreciate his efforts. That was the last time Kirk ever spoke to his brother. The trial lasted 8 months and became one of the largest surveillance abuse cases in federal court history. Kirk and I testified for 3 days, recounting the discovery of the cameras, the systematic manipulation we'd endured, and the psychological terror of realizing someone we trusted had been orchestrating our lives for years. Reggie showed no remorse throughout the proceedings. His defense team argued that he'd genuinely believed his surveillance was protective rather than predatory, but the evidence of financial exploitation and systematic psychological manipulation made that argument impossible to sustain. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge sentenced Reggie to 25 years in federal prison, calling his operation a profound violation of human dignity and community trust that strikes at the foundation of what makes neighborhoods safe and families secure. But legal justice, while necessary, couldn't repair the emotional devastation his crimes had inflicted on our community and our marriage. Kirk struggled with intense guilt and depression following the revelation of his brother's true nature. The man who had raised him, supported his education, and helped establish his career had been using that trust to exploit and manipulate dozens of families. Every positive memory of their relationship was now tainted by the knowledge that Reggie's kindness had been calculated and self-serving. "I brought him into our lives," Kirk said during one of our couples therapy sessions. "I gave him keys to our house, access to our computer systems, opportunities to install surveillance equipment. Every violation you suffered happened because I trusted him completely." Dr. Amanda Abrams, our therapist, helped us understand that predators like Reggie specifically target individuals with strong family bonds because those relationships provide the perfect camouflage for manipulation. His exploitation of your trust wasn't a character flaw in you, Kirk. It was a strategic choice by someone who understood how to weaponize love and loyalty. The therapy was essential because the surveillance had affected our relationship in ways we hadn't initially recognized. For months after the cameras were removed, I felt self-conscious in our own home, wondering if we'd found all the devices or if some sophisticated monitoring system remained hidden. Kirk developed hypervigilance about technology, unplugging electronics at night, and covering laptop cameras even when we weren't using them. Intimacy became complicated by the knowledge that our most private moments had been observed and analyzed for years. The bedroom that should have been our sanctuary now felt contaminated by memories of hidden cameras and violation. We eventually moved to a different house, but the psychological impact followed us. Our relationship with the Millbrook community was forever changed as well. While most neighbors were supportive once they understood we'd been victims rather than perpetrators, the shared experience of violation created an atmosphere of suspicion and wariness that lingered long after Reggie's arrest. Elizabeth and Angus became our closest allies during the recovery process, but even that friendship was affected by the trauma. Elizabeth blamed herself for not recognizing the signs of surveillance earlier, despite her cybersecurity expertise. "I should have insisted on a more thorough investigation from the beginning," she said repeatedly. "I should have realized that someone with Reggie's technical skills could create surveillance systems that standard detection equipment might miss." The broader community impact was devastating. 3 families moved away from Millbrook entirely, unable to feel safe in homes they knew had been systematically monitored. The Abrams family divorced 6 months after discovering that arguments Reggie had witnessed through surveillance had been used to manipulate business decisions that cost them their retirement savings. Support groups formed among Reggie's victims, but the healing process was complicated by the different ways people had been affected. Some families had lost money, others had been psychologically manipulated, and a few had been completely unaware they were being monitored until the FBI investigation revealed the evidence. The children affected by Reggie's surveillance faced particular challenges. Teenagers who discovered their personal development had been observed and documented experienced profound violations of trust and privacy. Parents struggled with how to explain that a trusted family friend had been watching their children grow up for criminal purposes. Kirk threw himself into advocacy work, helping other surveillance abuse victims navigate the legal system and understand their rights. He became a spokesperson for stronger privacy protection laws and testified before state legislative committees about the need for better oversight of home security companies. I found healing through my art, creating a series of graphic designs that explored themes of privacy, trust, and recovery. The work was therapeutic, but also served as public education about the psychological impact of surveillance abuse. Several pieces were displayed in a Portland gallery exhibition titled Hidden Eyes: Art from Surveillance Survivors. Slowly, over the course of 2 years, we began to rebuild our sense of safety and trust. The process wasn't linear. Setbacks and triggering moments continued to occur, but we learned to support each other through the ongoing recovery while honoring the trauma we'd survived. The scars left by Reggie's betrayal would never completely heal, but we were determined not to let his crimes define the rest of our lives or destroy the love that had survived his systematic attempts to manipulate and control us. 5 years have passed since Reggie's conviction, and Kirk and I now live in a completely different world than the one we inhabited during those terrifying months of discovery and legal battles. Our new home is in Coastal Grove, a small Oregon town 2 hours from Millbrook, where the constant sound of ocean waves provides a soothing backdrop to lives we've slowly rebuilt from the foundation up. The house we chose deliberately lacks the sophisticated technology that once made us feel secure. No smart home systems, no wireless cameras, no automated monitoring devices. We installed basic security measures, good locks, motion-activated exterior lights, and a simple alarm system, but nothing that could be compromised or used for surveillance. Privacy has become more valuable to us than convenience. Kirk's consulting business recovered and eventually thrived, though he now specializes in helping small businesses protect themselves from cybersecurity threats and surveillance abuse. His personal experience with systematic technological violation gives him unique insight into vulnerabilities that other consultants might miss. "I understand how predators think," he explains to clients. "I lived with one for years without recognizing the threat. That perspective helps me identify risks that aren't obvious to people who haven't experienced systematic manipulation." My graphic design work has evolved to focus primarily on privacy advocacy and digital rights education. I create materials for organizations that help surveillance abuse survivors, design campaigns for stronger privacy legislation, and develop educational resources for schools teaching children about digital safety and consent. The trauma changed us both in profound ways, but it also clarified our values and priorities in ways that ultimately strengthened our relationship. We learned that true security comes not from technology or external protection, but from honest communication, mutual support, and the ability to trust our own instincts even when others question our perceptions. We started a family 3 years ago. Our daughter Madeline is now 2 years old, and her presence has added joy and purpose to our lives that Reggie's manipulation never fully extinguished. Watching her explore the world with natural curiosity and trust reminds us daily that healing is possible and that the next generation deserves better protection than we received. Parenting after surveillance trauma required careful consideration of how to keep our daughter safe without transferring our anxieties to her. We've had to learn the difference between reasonable precautions and paranoid hypervigilance, ensuring that our protective instincts don't limit her ability to form healthy relationships with trusted adults. The support network we built during our recovery remains strong. Elizabeth and Angus moved to Coastal Grove 2 years ago, drawn by the community we've helped create for surveillance abuse survivors. Uncle Archie visits regularly, though his relationship with Kirk remains complicated by guilt over his initial skepticism about our claims regarding Reggie. "I should have trusted you immediately," he said during his most recent visit. "Family loyalty should have meant believing you, not the person manipulating you. We've learned to forgive the people who failed to support us during our crisis, understanding that Reggie's manipulation was sophisticated enough to fool even those who cared about us. The real lesson wasn't about who we could trust, but about trusting ourselves when something felt wrong even if we couldn't immediately prove it." The broader impact of Reggie's case led to significant legal and social changes. Oregon now requires comprehensive background checks and licensing for home security installers. Federal legislation has strengthened penalties for surveillance abuse and provided better resources for victims. The case is studied in law enforcement training programs as an example of how predators can exploit trust and social connections to avoid detection. Reggie himself remains in federal prison, eligible for parole in 15 years. We receive annual notifications about his status, but we've chosen not to follow his appeals or rehabilitation progress. Our healing required letting go of anger and focusing on building positive futures rather than remaining connected to his destruction. Sometimes people ask if we regret the years we lost to Reggie's manipulation, or if we wish we'd never trusted him in the first place. The answer is complicated. We regret the violation and trauma, but we don't regret the love and openness that made us vulnerable to his exploitation. The capacity to trust deeply, to welcome people into our lives and homes, to believe in family bonds and community connections, these remain strengths even though they were exploited. Reggie's crimes taught us to be more discerning about trust, but they didn't teach us to stop trusting entirely. Our story became public not just through news coverage and legal proceedings, but through our decision to speak openly about surveillance abuse and its impact. We've discovered that many people have experienced violation of their privacy and autonomy, but lack language or support to address it effectively. The most important lesson we've learned is that safety isn't about preventing all possible threats, but about building resilience to recover from the threats that do materialize. We couldn't have prevented Reggie's surveillance, but we could, and did, survive it, expose it, and help others recognize and resist similar manipulation. Our lives now are quieter but deeper, more cautious but also more intentional. We've learned that the greatest protection against predators isn't technology or isolation, but communities of people who support each other's right to live with dignity, privacy, and authentic choice. That's a lesson worth remembering, and worth sharing with anyone who might need to hear it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.